When Julia and Mason Holloway bought the property near Beerwah, Queensland, they didn't think much about its legacy. The modest house, nestled among eucalyptus trees and backing onto protected bushland, wasn't the Irwin family's public Australia zoo property. This was a smaller, quieter place, a private retreat Steve Irwin used during off days, rarely spoken about in interviews. A secluded home not far from the zoo, but hidden from tourists, media, and even many locals. The real estate agent called it a forgotten gem. Julia, an artist in her early 40s, was taken by the soft light through the large windows and the feeling of being completely alone with nature. Mason, a quiet IT consultant who worked remotely, loved the absence of neighbors. They moved in late summer, thrilled by their luck in snagging such an underpriced property. Only a few weeks after moving in, they learned the truth. Their next-door neighbor, a retired park ranger named Doug, brought it up casually over the fence. "You know who used to own that place, right?" Doug asked, tipping his hat against the sun. "No," Julia replied. "Just that it had been empty for a while." "Steve Irwin," Doug said. "Croc hunter himself. This was his little getaway. Came here when the zoo got too loud. Kept it quiet. After he passed, no one touched the place for years." Julia felt a strange chill. The house had felt untouched. There was an air of frozen time inside, as if someone had walked out one afternoon and never returned. The first oddity was the lizards. A bearded dragon began showing up every morning on the kitchen window ledge, always in the exact same spot. Julia, an animal lover, thought it was adorable at first. Then came more. Skinks, geckos, even a small monitor lizard once all perched silently at windows, or inside, staring with unnatural stillness. "It's like they're waiting for something," she muttered to Mason one night. He was half asleep, unconcerned. Then came the scratching. It wasn't rats. Julia knew that sound from old apartments in Sydney. This was deeper, slower, as if claws dragged along wood inside the walls. Sometimes it circled the bedroom. One night it came from under their bed. They began hearing a voice. It wasn't shouting, not clear, just a man's voice, warm but insistent, muffled by distance like someone whispering through a thick wall. Sometimes it came from the back deck, sometimes from the trees. It always said the same thing: "You have to be careful." Mason assumed it was a neighbor's TV, until they walked out into the bush one evening and heard it again right behind them. No one was there. Julia discovered the room by accident. Behind a wardrobe in the guest room was a false wall roughly sealed. She noticed a draft one day and pried it open. Behind it, a narrow door, padlocked. She debated telling Mason, but something told her not to. That night, while he was asleep, she broke it open. Inside was a small, dim study. Dust covered every surface, but nothing had been touched in years. A corkboard with pinned photos of reptiles, hand-drawn sketches of habitats, journals, VHS tapes marked Private SI. One photo pinned to the corkboard stood out. Steve Irwin, shirtless, holding a small crocodile, his face unusually serious. Written in pen above it, "He followed me back here." She took the tapes to the living room. One by one, she played them on their old VHS player. They were home videos, not shows. Footage of Steve speaking directly to the camera, late at night. His face pale, sweat on his brow. In the background, always something moving. Flickers of motion in the trees behind him. In one, his hands shook. "There's something in this land," he whispered. "Something old. Not one of the crocs. Not even a reptile, I don't think. It mimics. Stares. I don't sleep here anymore. But when I do, it talks." The tape ended with static. Julia sat frozen for minutes. Mason began waking up before dawn. Not for work. Just up. Standing in the yard barefoot, staring into the trees. He claimed he saw an animal huge, like a Komodo, but upright. He started collecting rocks from the bush. Strange shapes. He'd pile them in the living room in spirals. When Julia asked why, he said it made the animals calm. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he said one evening. "The way they gather. The way they watch." Julia began sleeping with the lights on. Mason stopped speaking during the day, only muttering things under his breath at night. First, she thought he was talking to her. Then she realized he was answering questions no one had asked. One morning, she found him crouched in the locked study, staring at the corkboard. The room had been sealed again, the wardrobe pushed back. "You weren't supposed to go in there," he whispered. "He told me." The final night began with thunder. Queensland's storms are loud, and the house groaned under the wind. Julia tried to sleep, but Mason was gone. Again, she found him outside, shirtless, kneeling in mud. All around him animals, lizards, frogs, a single dingo, a wallaby. None of them moved, just stared like statues. Mason was speaking to the dark. "He's not gone," he said. "He's part of this place now. The land keeps him, just like it kept the other one." Lightning flashed, and for a moment Julia saw it. Not a person, not an animal, something tall, vague, at the tree line. It flickered like old videotape distortion. It bent toward Mason like a curious predator. Then the animals scattered. Mason collapsed. He was never the same. Julia sold the house a month later. Mason lives in a private facility near Brisbane. He doesn't talk much, but sometimes he hums to the birds that land on his window. And sometimes, late at night, he repeats the same phrase. "You have to be careful." The house still stands, empty now, but the lizards haven't left. And every so often, someone walking past claims they hear a man's voice calling gently from the trees, not scared, not angry, just watching, forever part of the wild, just like he always was, just like Steve Irwin. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. It was more than a year before anyone stayed in the house again. By then, the vines had started to overtake the gutters. Rust formed along the shed's hinges. The real estate listing stayed up quietly with no photos of the interior and no mention of the previous owners. Julia's name was never revealed. Mason's condition remained off the record. But in mid-June, just as the air in Queensland took on that brief illusion of coolness, the property was leased, not sold, to a single-occupant Dr. Penelope Krause, 51, a visiting biologist from New Zealand. She was spending a 6-month sabbatical working on a monograph about predatory behavior in monitor lizards and Australian serpentines. Penelope wasn't superstitious. She had no children. Her only companion was an old Labrador named Tully. Her friends called her no-nonsense Penny, and she lived up to it. The isolation of the Irwin retreat appealed to her. She needed silence, needed data. She moved in during the winter solstice, her beat-up 4WD loaded with cages, microscopes, field notebooks, and one cracked kettle she'd refused to replace since grad school. The house welcomed her in the most peculiar way, with stillness. Not quiet stillness. There were no creaks, no groaning trees. The wind didn't whistle. It pressed against the windows like held breath. Penny liked it. She found the silence crisp. She began to set up her equipment along the back deck, which overlooked the bushland, not knowing that it was the very place Julia once heard whispers in the dark. On her second night, as she catalogued her field gear, she noticed the bearded dragon. It sat on the deck rail, unmoving. Its eyes were too bright for nightfall. Penny walked toward it slowly, notebook in hand. It didn't run. Then, from the gum tree just beyond the fence, something fell, a thump. Heavy. She turned, but saw nothing. When she looked back, the lizard was gone. She called it a strange coincidence in her notes. She would refer to it again months later as Subject 01, observed compulsion toward residents. Penny didn't discover the sealed room until week 3. It was a bump in the wall that tipped her off, a slightly misaligned baseboard, sticking up half a centimeter. She pried it back with a screwdriver and saw the seam perfectly rectangular. With a crowbar and persistence, the wardrobe rolled forward, revealing the narrow door. Not locked now. The padlock lay beside it on the floor, broken clean in half. She paused. The Labrador, Tully, stood 10 feet behind her, staring with tail tucked. Inside, the air was colder, and the smell earthy, old, but not dust, like wet stone. The room was as Julia had left it, corkboard with pinned photos, faded paper maps of the property, a half-collapsed couch, and on the desk 3 VHS tapes, marked with grease pencil. One said, "Don't let them follow you." The tapes weren't Penny's focus. She was more interested in the maps. Several had hand-drawn notation sketches of trails that weren't listed on any official registry. One section, behind the house to the northwest, was circled 3 times in red, labeled in shaky pen, "Tracks end here but they watch." She took the maps and left the room. Tully refused to follow. Penny waited until late afternoon before following the map. The circled location was only a few kilometers through the bush, but the trail was almost invisible. She wore her hiking boots, brought a handheld GPS, and carried a walking stick more for snakes than balance. Tully remained at the house, pacing near the back door. She found the site just as the sun began to lower. It wasn't a clearing. It was a dead zone, patch of forest where nothing moved. No birdsong, no breeze. The ground dipped ever so slightly, forming a natural depression, overgrown with brambles and ferns. But in the center, unmistakably a large imprint, shaped like an elongated human foot, at least a meter long, deep, old, dried at the edges. There were no other footprints leading to or from it. Penny knelt and took samples of the soil. As she did, her GPS lost signal. The screen went white, then flickered black. She tapped it. Nothing. Then a low click came from behind her. She turned. No one. But the trees looked different. Their branches hung lower. The bush felt tighter. Penny stood quickly, backing out from the dip. Her boot caught on a root and she stumbled but didn't fall. And then, again, that click, louder this time. Not metal. Not an animal. Almost like a camera shutter. Or something mimicking one. Back at the house, Penny replayed her bodycam footage. The entire hike had been recorded. For the most part, it was unremarkable. But at the 38:12 mark in the exact frame where she had looked away to examine the footprint, there was a figure. Blurred. Pale. Tall. It stood behind a tree roughly 6 meters from her, unmoving. When she turned back to look, it vanished between frames. She rewound, slowed the playback. It wasn't Steve. Not even human. Too thin. The head too narrow. The limbs too long. She isolated the image and froze it. The resolution blurred at the edges like film exposed to heat. That night, she heard the whisper, not outside. Inside. Right behind her as she sat at her desk. "You have to be careful." Her kettle whistled in the kitchen. But she hadn't turned it on. Penelope Krause stood in the hallway, motionless. From the kitchen, the kettle whistled louder, its pitch not shrill, but off, like a recording slowed by half a frame. Warped and hollow. She didn't remember turning it on, didn't recall even filling it. But the sound was real, climbing in intensity, pushing against the walls like pressure underwater. Tully growled from the front room. Not barking, growling. His ears flat, back arched, eyes locked on something just beyond the kitchen doorway. Penelope stepped forward, slowly, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. One hand brushed the wall to steady herself. The hallway felt longer than she remembered, stretching like a tunnel in a dream. As she reached the threshold to the kitchen, the kettle suddenly stopped. Mid-whistle. A clean cut, like someone had ripped a needle off a vinyl record. Silence. The kind of silence that leans into your ears, like it wants to say something but doesn't know the language. The kettle sat on the stove perfectly still. No steam. No heat. And next to it, a shape on the counter that hadn't been there earlier, a small, leather-bound notebook, half-wrapped in old twine. Its cover was stained with a smudge of reddish-brown. Penny didn't recognize it. It hadn't been in the house inventory. She reached out and touched it, the leather cold, slightly moist. The moment her fingers touched the cover, a sound echoed behind her, a thud, a soft one, like something heavy falling just outside the back door. She turned. Through the kitchen window, the deck was empty, but the eucalyptus tree that stood near the edge of the bushland was swaying violently. There was no wind. She brought the notebook to her work table, keeping it away from her lab equipment. Tully wouldn't come near it. He sat in the corner, whining faintly. The handwriting inside was erratic, hurried, looping strokes written with uneven pressure. At first glance, it resembled a personal journal. But the entries were dated irregularly, and several of them had entire passages blacked out with what looked like charcoal or ash. Only fragments remained legible. It knows when you observe it. They don't mimic perfectly, listen for the breath. Steve thought he could confront it. I don't think he ever left. Then a drawing, crude, yet exact in its anxiety. A tall figure, crouched at the tree line, its legs too long, its back arched at a painful angle. No face, just a suggestion of deep, sunken eyes. The next page had a single sentence. If you hear his voice, it's already too late. Penelope closed the notebook and pushed it away. Her hands were trembling. That night, Penelope decided to sleep on the couch. She left the bedroom door open, the lights in the hallway on. Tully refused to leave her side, curling up close against her legs. For a while, the house remained calm. The sounds of the bush returned faintly through the window's insects, distant frogs, the low rustle of possums. At around 2:30 a.m., she woke to a sound like furniture being dragged. Not inside, outside, the deck. She sat up. The sound came again. A heavy, slow scrape across timber. She moved to the window and peeked through the curtains. There was nothing on the deck. But the large, iron deck chair, the one she'd never used, was now facing the house. Not the forest. The house. As she stared at it, trying to process, something shifted in her peripheral vision. She looked down the hallway, and her heart seized. The wardrobe in the guest room was open again. Light from the hallway lamp cast a narrow shadow through the crack in its door. Inside, something shifted, a sound like breath through wet leaves. Tully barked, then one sharp bark that echoed through the house. He jumped off the couch and ran toward the study room, barking louder, more desperate. Penny followed, instinct taking over. By the time she reached the study, Tully was frozen at the doorway, growling at the far corner of the room. But there was no one there. Only the corkboard. Every pin, every paper, every photo gone. Just one thing left, fluttering slightly in the draft of her breath, a note pinned in the center, in the same frantic handwriting from the notebook. You're not the first to find this place, but you might be the last to leave. The next morning, Penelope tried to shake it off. Rationalize. Sleep deprivation. Isolation. Suggestions planted by whatever was written in the notebook. But the camera didn't lie, not the one on her tripod, which had been recording the front deck all night. When she replayed the footage, there were hours of stillness. A bit of wind. A moth. Then, around 2:33 a.m., movement. The chair shifted. Not quickly. Not jerkily. It rotated smooth, deliberate, until it faced the sliding glass door that led into the living room. Then, in the reflection of the glass, not the deck, there was a face. A man's face, wide-eyed, smiling faintly, like someone trying to comfort a child before a difficult conversation. Penny froze the frame, enhanced it. The facial features were unmistakable. Steve Irwin, but not as he appeared on TV. This face was pale, tight-skinned, the eyes too wide, the smile too fixed. Something inhuman pulling at a very human mask. And just behind that face, another reflection too tall to be him. A shape she'd seen before. Dr. Penelope Krause never filed her final research report. She was scheduled to return to Auckland in December, but her flight was never taken. Her email went silent. Colleagues assumed she extended her sabbatical. The university received no forwarding address. Her house in Queensland, Steve Irwin's old property, was found completely undisturbed by the time local authorities were called weeks later. No signs of forced entry. No blood. No struggle. Her equipment remained in place. Microscope lenses still clean. The Labrador, Tully, was found locked inside the bathroom alive, but shaking violently. Clumps of fur torn out. There was only one clue left behind. A single Polaroid photograph, placed on the center of her desk. It showed the back deck. In the photo, the iron chair faced the bush again. The door to the forest was open. And in the lower right corner, just visible in the glare of the flash, was a handwritten note. I followed the trail. I think I saw him, but it wasn't him. It wears his voice now. The property was closed indefinitely. No one else has lived there since. But locals say that sometimes, when the wind dies completely, you can still hear a voice coming from deep in the trees, soft and friendly, calling out like an echo across time. Crikey, look at this little beauty. And then silence. Total silence. The kind that presses down like something watching but never blinking. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.